So my name is Brett Middlestats. I'm the Director of Research and the Associate Professor here at the OII. I should say we are being joined both in person today and also with some people online. So hello to everybody, or I should say hello to everybody online. Cameras in the back, and hello to everybody here in the room. So today, I'd like to welcome you to the talk, The Promise and Perils of China's Regulation of Artificial Intelligence. We're delighted to have Professor Angela Zhang here today. Thank you for joining us. You're going to go into the dynamic complexities of China's AI regulatory landscape and its broad implications for the future of AI governance. So Angela Zhang is an Associate Professor of Law at the University of Hong Kong, Director of the Philip K.H. Wang Center for Chinese Law. Widely recognized as a leading authority on China's tech regulation, Angela has written extensively on the topic. She's the author of Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism, How the Rise of China Challenges Global Regulation, which was named one of the best political economy books of 2021 by ProMarket. Angela's second book, which is the subject of the talk today, Highwire, How China Regulates Big Tech and Governs Its Economy, was released by Oxford University Press just last month. And in fall 2024, I'm happy to say Angela will join the University of Southern California as a professor of law. So congrats on that as well. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started with the talk. Just so everybody is aware, the talk is being recorded today. The event's being recorded. It will be posted on our website following completion. The presentation today will run for about 30 to 40 minutes. It will be followed by a Q&A session. If you do have questions, please do save them until the end of the talk. If you are joining us online, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to post your questions. At the end of the talk today, we'll have both questions from within the room and also questions from our online audience. And just to say that the Q&A will be included in the recording. So again, just please be aware of that when you're asking your questions. So with that, that's the end of the housekeeping. So Angela, it's great to have you here, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Hi. Very honored to be here, and thank you guys for coming. So I have started, just like a lot of researchers, become interested in AI since the emergence of ChatGPT. And I was writing my book and close to finalization, I realized, oh, I need a chapter on AI, otherwise, it seems like I'm missing a big part of what's going on. And for those of you, I'm so glad that there's a lot of interest in Chinese AI regulation. And I assume that you guys must know, there's a lot of things going on with Chinese AI legislation. In 2021, China was the first to roll out a very comprehensive draft of measures on regulating recommendation algorithm. And in 2022, China introduced draft measures to regulate deepfake. And 2 months after ChatGPT emerged, China already started cracking down a lot of the GPT-like services in Apple's App Store. And in April last year, China introduced the world's first comprehensive rules to regulate generative AI. And within 3 months, China already finalized the law. I mean, think about the EU AI Act, which takes like a long time to legislate, starting from 2018. And now you're very close to the finishing line. But in China, things are done, in a split second. And that makes China the first country to have very comprehensive rules to regulate generative AI, the new and transformative technology. And by the way, China is the first country, and I think the only country so far, to have introduced a licensing regime for offering generative AI services to the public. As far as I'm aware of, correct me if I'm wrong, Brent, it doesn't seem like the EU AI Act imposed an ex-ante licensing requirement, right? And China is the one who have insisted upon that, right? So if you take into this broader picture, it looks like China is very strict with its AI regulation. China seems to have great ambition to become an AI regulatory superpower. And also this kind of regulatory ambition might be holding back China's AI development, as a lot of people have pointed out. Now, in today's talk, I'm going to challenge that kind of widely held perception and trying to bring more nuances to the debate here. I will start by introducing the dynamic pyramid model, which is the central theme of my book, High Wire. And I will use this model to analyze how China is regulating with AI. And I will also offer some predictions of what it will going to happen in the future, because we are still at a very early stage of thinking about regulation, and also talk about the pros and cons with China's current approach. So the book was released last month, and it's now available on Amazon. The print version, you can get it from the Amazon US site. You can also order from OUP's website. And if you go to my personal website, you can see the OUP discount code where you get 30%, which is very important, right? So, look, I mean, this book sells well. I mean, I think this book would do better than my first book. And that's actually my goal as an author. I don't compete with other people. I only compete with myself. I want my second book to do better than my first book. And so far, I'm pleased to see, it is doing better, because this book, unlike my first book, which touched upon one subject area, which is antitrust, right? I mean, this book covered the entire tech sector. Now, the Chinese tech sector contributes to over 40% of China's GDP, and this is the most important sector in the Chinese economy, right? So any form of economic intervention in this area is bound to have enormous financial and economic consequences. So this book will appeal to a very large, a very broad audience who are interested in regulation, investment in China, Chinese economy, political economy, internet regulation, and etc. So I think this book will sell better than my first book. And the book have 11 chapters. And for the most part, it deals with how China regulates its platform. Now, China is the only country besides the United States that have been able to foster like so-called big tech companies, right? I mean, so, now you just mentioned the DMA and DSA. I mean, you have the Chinese company on your target list, right? I mean, companies like ByteDance. They're very huge, right? I mean, so, and before China's internet crackdowns in 2020, starting from 2020, China has 3 or 4 big tech companies among the world's 10 largest tech firms. But nowadays, they are much weaker, particularly, in the parallel, the US tech firms really took off in the past couple of years with the AI boom, where the Chinese company had become weaker. But before that, China really was able to foster big tech companies that are on par with the United States. And because they're in their own ecosystem, they have their own regulations. So the book went in great length in addressing how these firms have been regulated in antitrust data and labor regulations. And as well as I also have a part 3, which I talk about platform style regulation, because for the most part, platforms are very important regulator, because they are in charge of resolving a lot of the conflicts originated from the platform, right? I mean, so they're important quasi-regulator, and they often co-regulate with the state. So there's one part I talk about how they adapt to the public regulation by self-regulating and self-governance. And in the last part, I look forward and compare the China's approach of tech regulation with what's happening in the EU and the United States. And then I also assess the outcome, the economic consequences of China's tech regulation, which people don't often do. You see in Europe, people just see, oh, the commission have done this and done that, but what are the consequences? And then in the last chapter, I look ahead and see how China will regulate AI. But I think the most important contribution of this book is actually the first part, because in this area, the law is very fluid. Things keep changing all the time. But what doesn't change, and I think what is the most important, interesting contribution of the book is the regulatory framework, right? How do we think about how China regulates generally, right? And so in the first part of the book, I introduced this analytical framework, and most importantly is the dynamic pyramid model that I'm going to explain to you. Now, the dynamic pyramid model has 3 major features. So this is inspired by the system theory, which sees our world as a highly interconnected and complex system, right? I mean, so if you think about it this way, China's regulatory system has three important features. In terms of the regulatory structure, I use hierarchy to describe it because it involves players from different tiers of the regulatory system. Okay, you have at the apex, you have the top policymakers, then you have the regulators who are in charge of implementing the top policies, and then you have firms who are quite submissive to the agencies because they rarely define the agency's demands, right? They don't fight, they don't challenge, unlike here. And then at the bottom are the public, because their voices tend to be censored, like muted due to information control in the Chinese political economy, right? So we have a very hierarchical regulatory structure, and that tends to lead to a lot of volatility. The reason is in this structure, when the regulators, they respond to the top's initiatives, right, all the time, rather than being held accountable to the people at the bottom, right? Because it's a very hierarchical structure. And that tends to lead to a phenomenon that regulators either do very little or do too much, okay? When the top's initiatives are not very clear, or what they are supposed to do might be deemed in contravention with the top's initiative, then they will err on the side of caution. They will do very little. But when the top send out very clear signal that this is the way to go, then they will do as much as they can. So you see very often the agency overreach in those circumstances, because this is the point they want to demonstrate the loyalty to the top. And if you don't do that, people may suspect that you are not listening, or, other people might get in your turn. So at this point, they will try to do a lot, or do too much, right? I mean, and that leads to volatility. You see why, the Chinese policy process is often characterized by a lot of dramatic pendulum swing, and very lax, and all of a sudden very strict, right? I mean, so people say they tend to be characterized by cycles of regulatory tightening and then regulatory easing. And that also gives people the impression that Chinese regulation is very erratic, very arbitrary, and very unpredictable. And that leads to the outcome, which I use fragility to describe it. Now, how do we measure the resilience of a particular piece of policy? I use two dimensions to measure it. One is side effects, and one is information lack. Okay, so you can imagine a 2x2 table here. By side effects, I mean just like you're taking drugs, we're supposed to use the drug to treat certain disease, but it can create side effects. And sometimes the side effects are so strong that could overtake the original problem you're trying to address, right? I mean, this is what you observe often in the Chinese context. Well-intentioned regulatory measures can generate vast unintended consequences. And that leaves the policymakers in a game of whack-a-mole, because they have to deal with constant, regulatory crisis. And also, sometimes it takes a long time for them to realize the problem. So by the time they realize the problem, it's often very late, already resulted in a lot of irreparable damage, right? I mean, so that leads to very fragile regulatory outcome. Now, the cool thing about the book is that I have this one single diagram to synthesize everything in the book, okay? So what I want to show you here, obviously, you still need to buy the book, okay? But what I want to show you here, and I'm not going to into the details of this, because there's a lot of fascinating details in the book, is that you see these three features are actually interconnected by are highly interconnected with each other, right? I mean, when you have a very hierarchical regulatory structure, it tends to lead to a lot of volatility in the policy process, as we just discussed. And then when you have a lot of policy volatility, it often amplifies the side effects, right? I mean, lead to a lot of fragility in regulatory outcome. Now, when you have a very fragile regulatory outcome, it can reinforce volatility, right? I mean, and introduce more uncertainty and volatility in the process. And by the way, it can fragility in turn can reinforce hierarchy, which is what we found in China's consumer tech crackdown and in consumer internet crackdown, and as well as a lot of policy intervention you have seen in the past few years. Because when investors' sentiments are very low, they were so, they feel so so bad after this very severe crackdown, private sector tend to retreat, investor retreat, but state institutions start to come in, right? To come in and fill in the void left by the private institution. And also the state institution will also gain more regulatory leverage over the private sector. And that reinforces the hierarchy. So now we have a feedback loop, right? I mean, so gradually this system will lead to more hierarchy, more volatility, and more fragility. Now, I use this diagram to perfectly describe what you see with China's tech crackdown between 2020 and 2022. But that's not the subject for today's talk, okay? In today's talk, we're talking about AI, right? It's a new and exciting technology that is only at the very beginning of the regulatory cycle. So how do we apply this diagram to predict what will happen with China's AI regulation? Now, to go back to the cover of the book, I mean, think about what does the Chinese government want from AI? Just like the man walking on high wire. On the one hand, as an authoritarian government, it is inherently insecure about information control, right? I mean, that is the primary motivation why you see the Chinese government, the cyberspace administration of China have been so proactive in churning out a lot of the regulations targeting AI technology, right? Because it's worried that those AI generative output can interfere with public discourse. This is the bottom line of the Chinese Communist Party. But on the other hand, you know, AI is expected to bring enormous economic benefits to the Chinese economy. We just finished the 2 sessions of the National People's Congress, where the new buzzword is the new quality productive force, right? And then AI is highlighted as one of the technology that gets expected to power the Chinese economy and to revitalize it, especially considering that the Chinese economy is at rock bottom at the moment. Not to mention the big elephant in the room, which is the Sino-US tech rivalry, where the 2 countries are bidding for AI supremacy. And a few years ago, you know, the US, leading US scientists and industry experts were warning that, look, I mean, China might overtook us in AI capability. You have Eric Schmidt and Grant Allison writing a lot of reports, you know, warning China might overtook US. But now what you see, you know, with the emergence of ChatGPT, the gap is actually widening, where you see China is falling behind, particularly after the US imposed rounds of export restriction on NVIDIA chips on Chinese AI firms, right? I mean, so China feel desperate urge to catch up with the US. I mean, this is a battle they cannot afford to lose, right? I mean, so how do you balance these competing interests? Very strict information control plus the desire to claim AI supremacy. Now, if we look at all the Chinese AI legislation so far, they have a very clean theme. That is content moderation. And that requirement of content moderation, which actually is a licensing requirement, which we talked about earlier, right? I mean, it's called security assessment. And that requirement actually dates back to 2018, when the Cyberspace Administration of China introduced rules to regulate online platforms with public opinion mobility. So you see that where that's coming from. They're worried about public discourse. They're worried about information control. And that's the key priority of all the AI legislation. You consistently see this requirement in the regulation to regulate recommendation algorithm, in the regulation to regulate deepfake, as well as the regulation to regulate generative AI, right? I mean, so this is the key and most important requirement in all this AI regulation. But I would want to highlight that this, yes, they have this requirement is seemingly very strict, but with regard to everything else, you know, they are not priorities. And I will even predict that China will be very, very lax with everything else. The reason is because if you take a closer look at the Chinese AI law, particularly the most recent piece of legislation aimed at regulating generative AI, you see the law has a very distinct feature. It kind of combines industrial policy, integrate industrial policy with the law, which is something you don't see. You know, the AI Act has over 430 something pages, 113 provisions and 13 annexes, but I don't see any single provision that look like this Chinese law, okay? The reason is because the Chinese government have relied very heavily on the expressive function of its law to enable AI development, right? It's consciously aware that, yes, I am imposing the strict licensing requirements that might, put off people. So to bring back the balance, I put in a lot of industry-friendly language, and precisely the point that I want to encourage the entrepreneurs and the investors to invest and enable this technology, right? So the law, in my opinion, has very little protective value, but rather it's mostly serving the function of signaling and coordination, okay? So how does the Chinese government send signal to the platform, the market participants? When we compare the first draft of the interim measures to regulate generative AI and the final draft that was promulgated in August last year, we saw very big contrast. So you may recall in the first draft, they had contained some provisions such as, AI generative output should be accurate and true, right? Which is impossible for any AI service provider to satisfy, given the hallucination problem, right? And these things are not within the control. But in the final draft, you see these provisions, similar provisions have been significantly watered down, right? Instead of insisting upon true and accurate information, they said, you make the best efforts to ensure that your content is true and accurate. I mean, so that's a big, big step down, right? I mean, significantly weaken this requirement. Now, in the final version, they also significantly clarify the scope has been significantly narrowed. It only applies to those AI services that are offered to the public. So to the extent that if you're training your AI model within Oxford's lab, or if you are only offering services to enterprise, to Huawei, to ZTE, to Microsoft, for enterprise use, you're not subject to this law, right? So this is a very big carve-out. And you can also understand where that's coming from, because they're only worried about those with public opinion mobilities, right? Those interfere with public discourse. But if you're not offering to the public, you are not even subject to the interim measure to regulate generative AI, right? I mean, so, and that came as a very big relief to Chinese AI entrepreneurs and investors, because a lot of the small and medium-sized startups, they don't have the legal capacity to deal with all this licensing requirements, security assessment, right? I mean, they don't want to deal with those hassles, right? I mean, so it came as a relief that they're not subject to this regulation. And the watering down of this law also sent a very strong signal that something has changed. The people within the policy circle, they have shifted their attitude, right? Because what you see is the first draft of the law was introduced by one single agency, the Cyberspace Administration of China, which is the internet watchdog in China, in charge of monitoring and censorship, in charge of national security and censorship, information control, right? But the final version was jointly promulgated by 7 agencies, central ministries, right? And these include those ministries that have very clear bureaucratic missions and objectives to foster AI development. So you have the Ministry of Science and Technology, Ministry of Industry, Information Technology, the National Development and Reform Commission. I see these 3 central ministries as the key ministries in China that are in charge of China's self-sufficiency initiative to catch up and stay competitive in the United States. So from that standpoint, they don't want any very strict regulation because they know this will put off development, right? I mean, so you can see this, we have a faction of pro-development within this legislative cohort, and you have a faction of agencies like the CAC who want to insist very strict regulation. And the ultimate product that was finalized in August last year shows us that this pro-development faction has prevailed over the pro-regulation faction, right? Because victory conveys power, right? And this policy signal is extremely important, not only for the industry as a whole, for the entrepreneurs, for the investors, right? Who have been through 18 months of crackdown of the internet sector, right? I mean, whose sentiments were very low already. They desperately need that assurances, particularly in the current economic climate where the economy was doing very badly, was in deep trouble, right? So they definitely need a very nurturing and friendly policy signal. But beyond that, it also sends a signal to the regulators, because in a lot of the areas of AI enforcement, there's no clear answer, right? This is a new and emerging technology and pose significant challenge to regulation, right? I mean, how should regulators, how should the courts respond? How should they decide cases? In cases of ambiguity, these policy signals important to guide the courts, guide the agencies in terms of what they should do, right? And so the other important functions of the Chinese AI legislation is coordination. So law work like a focal point to coordinate all the platform participants, the industry participants, the agencies to enable AI development. So the law try to coordinate different agencies because AI services has such wide applications. So many agencies can get involved. The law trying to coordinate all the industry participants. Think about the industry associations, the tech firms, the universities, right? Because the university contribute a lot of key AI talents to these AI labs. And the local government, which provide a lot of the logistic support for AI firms, right? You need the local backing, local government's backing in order to do business in China. So the law also, explicitly encourage all these people to get together. You create this AI ecosystem. The law trying to coordinate essential inputs into the AI, which are the data and the computing resources. So I particularly want to spend a bit more time talking about these two key inputs. China used to have a strong advantage in data resources when it comes to AI training, particularly when we talk about facial recognition technology, because of the government surveillance, right? I mean, they collected massive amount of facial data from the Chinese citizens, and Chinese AI firms often partner with the Chinese government, and Chinese government is a very important customer for China's leading AI firms, right? They got a lot of procurement contracts from the government, and they was able to leverage the government's abundant facial data to train the AI model. And that's why China has been able to foster the world's best AI facial recognition technology firms, right? I mean, it's now exporting it to all over the world. But when it comes to textual data like LLMs, China does not have that advantage anymore, right? To start with, China have there is very few Chinese language database. And there is even fewer open source database because the Chinese tech sector is very concentrated. And we have two major tech firms, we call it duopolies, the Alibaba and Tencent. They carve out the Chinese internet business into two major ecosystems and create two war gardens, basically, right? So they don't share data with the outside world. And so we have very few open source database, and it's all guarded by these big tech giants, right? I mean, so Chinese AI entrepreneurs face an acute challenge of where can I get, good database to train, particularly Chinese language database to train my AI model. And some of the leading players like Baidu and ByteDance, they openly admit that they have to use English source database to train the AI model. Now, the problem with using Wikipedia or using Reddit, these open source models to train AI is that, the AI output may not be aligned with the commonest value, right? So the firm will actually need to spend a lot of time to clean up the data, to filter the results, and to fine-tune the model, right? Which makes the process very costly. And for this reason, the Chinese government is trying to coordinate the public and private institutions to get together to create so-called data alliances, right? I know the UK government has a very keen eye on developing AI, but I don't think that it will go as far as encouraging universities or industries to get together to create data alliances to train AI model. But this is what the Chinese government is doing, and it is explicitly written into law. We want to facilitate and more, more coordination in the better utilization of data resources to address our data challenge. Now, China also wants to coordinate the better use of computing resources. Now, computing power is the biggest bottleneck Chinese AI firms have faced in recent years because of the US export restrictions. Even though we have a lot of big tech companies that are deep-pocketed, but they cannot get the most advanced NVIDIA chips, right? I mean, and so in response, the government is doing several things. They want to double down on developing the cutting edge AI chips, but that will take ages, right? I mean, it's a very complex supply chain, and it takes a long time for China to catch up. Now, what they're focusing on right now is the better and the more efficient use of computing resources. So China now has created a massive scheme called the Eastern Data Western Power project, where they're trying to use the data from the East because it's more populated than a lot of tech firms. That's where a lot of the tech firms were located. They can leverage the data, but the data centers will be relocated to the West because the West is less populated and the electricity and the water prices, the utility prices are cheaper, right? Because training and deploying the LMs consume vast amount of energy, right? So China is trying to better, more efficiently utilize its energy consumption to power AI. China is also offering a lot of vouchers to its small and medium-sized startup who are struggling to get computing power, right? Because even the bigger players like Alibaba, which used to offer a lot of cloud services to the small and medium-sized startups, now have difficulty training their own AI model. So they are stopping a lot of the contract, and the government is helping the smaller firms by offering them vouchers, offering discount for them to access the government-affiliated data centers. So now you see a proliferation of data centers all over the country, right? I mean, the government is trying to facilitate that. Now, China also have ambition to be a rule maker and trying to set the standard for AI. And China used to achieve great success, particularly with the 5G technology, right, where Huawei is the standard pioneer. But with AI, query how far China can go, particularly with generative AI, because now China is not a leading player in this area. Okay, so let me stop here. So basically, you see what China is doing actually is what I call a whole of society approach, that they mobilize every corner of the resource from China to trying to foster AI development. And the law explicitly encourage that, right? I mean, this is perfectly consistent with the approach the government has undertaken in order to develop other forms of hardcore technology in order to catch up with the United States. Think about semiconductor, new materials, new energy. I mean, there's a lot of areas that are deemed critical and strategic to China. China is adopting this whole of society approach, and AI is no exception here, okay? So what are the consequences? We have been through one full cycle of China's regulation of consumer tech businesses, which I see as a soft tech, right? I mean, AI is kind of like a hard tech, but we can look back upon how China regulates soft tech to try to predict how China will deal with AI, okay? Now, in the old days, like, I mean, nowadays we have the AI Plus initiative where the government is very supportive of AI development. But if you think about 10 years ago, we have the Internet Plus initiative, right? I mean, where the government is very supportive of the development of the consumer tech businesses. So in this very hierarchical regulatory structure, you see when the top leaders send out very, very, friendly policy signal, firms know how to regulate and lobby the regulators and the top policy makers. So despite the fact that you see tensions have started to emerge, a problem have accumulated at the platform level, agencies, they did very little, right? Remember what I said at the beginning, right? They either do very little or do too much. And at this point, they did very little because they don't want to be seen as doing things in contravention with Beijing's initiative. So they did very little and intervened, seldom intervene into this problem. So as a result, the information transmission from the regulator to the top was very slow. So the top doesn't know what are the problems until things become very bad, right? I mean, so this is what I'm worried about AI, because now we have this very friendly policy environment, right? So regulators will be very averse to take a very harsh stance. Well, just think about like what has happened in Europe, right? Now OpenAI has been investigated by every single, I mean, I guess it's a slight exaggeration, but it's by a lot of data authorities in continental Europe, right? I mean, and the French authority recently imposed a big fine on Google for IP infringement. I mean, European authorities mean businesses here. They are serious in, going after these AI firms. But have you seen any of the Chinese authority investigating any of the big AI play in China? For AI violation, for IP violation, infringement, or data privacy violation? No, right? I mean, and my prediction is that with this model, this dynamic pyramid model of regulation, they're unlikely to do that in the near future, of course, until something really bad happens, right? They have to reverse course. And very recently, China, the Chinese internet court, the Chinese court also got the message, right? I mean, from the signal, the friendly signal. So last November, the Chinese, the Beijing internet court issued a very controversial ruling recognizing copyright in an AI generative image. So China is actually the first country that ever done that. And that was a very controversial decision. And that also contrasted with the approach that you see in the United States, where the US Copyright Office and the courts have consistently denied granting copyright to AI generative image, despite the fact that users have put in a lot of efforts, right? But one of the most important reasons why the Chinese court have done that is because they're guided by policy, because they believe that if I give copyright to AI generative work, it's going to incentivize more AI use. And that will help the industry to further flourish and grow, right? I mean, so you see in cases of ambiguity, when they're not sure what to do, the policy is really important in helping them decide a case. But in this op-ed, I challenged the court's decision. I think it's quite short-sighted view, because if you think about it, yes, in the short term, it does incentivize industrialization and the growth of AI, but in the medium and short, longer term, this will run into another big problem of data scarcity. China already faced data scarcity problem, right? But if you keep giving a lot of incentives for people to use AI, and then humans will be less incentivized to create the work in the first place. But training the large LLMs still require, if you want to improve it, you still require high quality human content. You can't just keep feeding the machine with AI content, right? I mean, that will cause the models to become stupid, right? To cause dementia in the model, or cause the model to collapse, right? I mean, so you will eventually run into the problem of data scarcity when humans are actually disincentivized to create content that can be used to train AI model, right? So to sum up what I have said, I mean, look, I mean, the Chinese strategic lenient approach I have described so far appears to offer China a slight competitive advantage over firms in the EU and the United States, right? EU is very close to finalize its AI Act, and which is expected to impose a lot of pre-launch commitments on AI service providers, right? There's a lot of conformative tests if they need to introduce services to public, even though it's a self-assessment approach, it's not a license requirement. And EU has a bunch of other laws, right? I mean, you have the GDPR, which has, you know, serious application, and it's already in action. You have the DMA and DSA and many others that apply to these AI firms. And you also have very committed officials in Brussels who just do nothing but think about regulation, right? This is their job. They are the policy entrepreneurs who are seriously committed. And they will enforce the law, right? Unlike in China, right? And in the US, yes, at the federal and state level, you see very minimal light touch regulation. I know the Biden administration introduced sweeping executive order last October, but for the most part, it's performative, right? I mean, it's very minimal obligation on the firms, mostly transparency and disclosure requirements, and that's it, right? However, US is a very decentralized legal system. It has a lot of lawyers who do lawsuits, right? And so they have a lot of class action lawsuits going on. And, you know, companies like OpenAI and Microsoft and Meta, they face a lot of IP infringement lawsuits, data privacy lawsuits, discrimination lawsuits. These class action lawsuits, they have teeth, right? I mean, you can see, you know, New York Times is suing OpenAI and Microsoft and seeking billions of dollars. I know these cases can take forever, you know, by the time they reach the Supreme Court, it could become moot. But you are seeing they're having an impact on the business model of these firms, because you see OpenAI, Apple, Amazon, they're paying for content, right? I mean, you can say they're not paying enough, which is the reason why they are bringing these lawsuits and challenging them in court, but they are paying. But have you seen the Chinese firm paying? No, right? I mean, so that's what I'm saying. I think the current policy environment in China will be conducive to the industrial growth, at least in the short term, despite this licensing regime. Now, what are the pitfalls with the strategic linear approach that China is doing at the moment? The danger, however, is that as some analysts have pointed out, and China may be flirting with AI catastrophe. Now think about it. China have very weak institutional, it has very weak institutional environment, right? Weak legal institutions, you have rampant fraud in the Chinese economy. And in fact, as I described in the book, China is home to the world's largest underground economy that specializes in fraud, producing counterfeit, producing deepfake, producing, all kinds of fake stuff, right? I mean, so if you worry about, AI risk, I mean, China is one of the top countries that you need to worry about. But the Chinese people actually ranked the #1 in terms of the optimism about this AI technology. So that makes it even more worrisome, right? Of course, when things bad happen, because of this very centralized and hierarchical regulatory system, you can see the top leaders can immobilize a massive enforcement campaign, just as what we saw with China's tech crackdown between 2020 and 2022, right? I mean, they were able to get things done in very quickly, right? I mean, and they can try to address the problem as they emerge. The problem, however, is fragility, the regulatory outcome I talk about at the outset, right? Yes, despite the fact that you can come with very heavy-handed intervention, however, it can lead to vast unintended consequences, and that result in irreparable damage. And sometimes the damage was so big and so huge, it kind of overtook the original problem you're trying to address, right? I mean, so that's why, I'm worried about the fragile regulatory outcome when it comes to China's AI policy. And I know I'm kind of running out of time, so let me just emphasize this is the last slide, that because of the potential fragility in China's AI policy, that makes international cooperation even more important. So I applaud the UK for hosting the AI summit safety summit last November, and then invited China to the summit. I know that was a very controversial invitation. I remember Liz Truss even wrote an open letter saying that renouncing the invitation, asking UK to rescind the invitation. But if you think about what I just described, it actually is very important to get China onto the table, right? I mean, in a way to nudge China, and also to in a way to push China to do more with AI safety, and also through international cooperation, you actually bring in more information into the Chinese system. So the people within the regulatory system, they can get more informed decision and more informed knowledge about what's going on with AI risks, right? I mean, but the sad thing is the current geopolitical environment is making it very difficult for us to achieve meaningful and substantive cooperation in AI. So so AI is going to be my main gig in the next few years. And if you're interested in Chinese AI regulation or AI regulation in general, please follow me. Here's my personal website. And I would love to hear your feedback and comments. Thank you.
So thank you, Angela, for such a fascinating talk. I'm sure there's tons of questions in the room and online. I'm going to take advantage of my position here and ask you a question if I can. I'm curious in particular about the training data stuff that you discussed, and like the problem that you're eventually going to run into of running out of good, genuine data to improve systems down the line. I'm wondering, so what's the situation in China? Because we've seen lots of lawsuits in the EU and in the US around IP or around data protection, privacy. And you said that there's a lack of enforcement in China. But are the regulatory frameworks there that could be enforced, or is it, are there not appropriate frameworks to do that sort of thing?
Right. I mean, if China wants to regulate something, they can regulate it even without any framework, right? I mean, they can, think about how they deal with the DD, right? I mean, back in 2021, I mean, they just go ahead and then they can introduce the law retroactively if they want to do that. And obviously, there's a lot of laws in China. So they can, find something to discipline these firms if they want to. The question is, we shouldn't stay our attention on the law itself, right? I mean, we actually really need to look at the enforcement, what they have done. so far, right? So let's not take the law too literally, take them too seriously. We really need to see the outcome and what are the driving forces, the institutional dynamics behind, and that will affect how they will enforce the law. Given the current very friendly policy environment, I just don't see that they will take very aggressive actions to discipline these companies. It's not like they're not doing anything, right? I mean, they have a lot of regulatory tools on their plate. They can pick and choose, right? I mean, they cherry pick the easy and lenient ones. Yeah.
Thank you. Questions in the room here?
Yeah. In the list of priorities in China, is this?
Would you like to introduce
Oh,
yourself?
sorry, my name is Elijah. I'm a student here at OII. In the list of priorities in China, is AI, would you say, a paramount priority in terms of development versus others? And then how would you compare that to, let's say, the ranking of AI in the EU or the US right now in terms of the government prioritization of it?
Well, because AI has very wide applications, it flows like electricity, right? I mean, so it can apply to software, right? I mean, can power recommendation algorithm like TikTok, that's so addictive, and it can power robotics, which China is #1, and can power and EV. I mean, China is a very good, a big manufacturer these days, and it can power ChatGPT, right? So depending on the specific context, and obviously Chinese government is main priority and focus is on those hardcore technology, in particular those critical areas that China need to catch up with the United States. So it care maybe less about those addictive algorithms, but care more about semiconductor, EVs, and those new growth points that China can succeed. Yeah.
Angela, I'll just switch spots with you, so I'll keep an eye on the online
Okay.
chat. But
Okay.
yeah.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Judy. I'm from the business school. So I'm quite interested in AI ethics. So my question is ethics in general, but relating to what you were talking about in China, do you think AI ethics is going to be a consideration maybe in the future for corporations especially? And the reason why I ask is this, fully knowing the human rights record, but however, with the two large companies like, Alibaba and also Tencent, they are global companies. So it's something that they must consider. So will the Chinese government consider this particular area in the future, knowing that there are research reports saying that with the proliferation of AI, there's going to be a lot of effects to people, not only people when school kids use a lot of computer usage like they do in the US, and I live in the US right now.
Yeah.
There is a lot of harmful effects.
Yeah.
So how do you actually see that moving forward in China and also around the world?
There's a lot of talks, a lot of discussion, a lot of reports about AI ethics in China. I would say, there's a lot here, but you don't see less activities in China. There's a lot of talking. However, query how much is cheap talk, right? I mean, because a lot of time, these reports were provide, actually companies like Alibaba, Tencent, I mean, these are the leading players that will be the first to introduce AI ethics report and showcase the compliance and things. But they're not subject to very hardcore monitoring and assessment, right? I mean, so that's why, I'm very skeptical about, how serious they are in terms of the AI ethics, because at the end of the day, as a very large digital corporation, your first and foremost priority is to profit driven, considering now they have a lot of pressures because of the economic, they were not doing very well, right? I mean, economic slowdown, right? I mean, so even further pressure. And now if you don't have very strict regulatory oversight over what they're doing, and I mean, you just have no idea whether they will comply with AI ethics, right? I mean, you can see within this type of very large organization, they also have factions. There will be people who are in charge of compliance and ethics. They will emphasize on those, but then you have the business side which emphasize more on the business fundamentals. And in this kind of business environment, I would see the business people will kind of gain the upper hand, right? I mean, and the people in charge of ethics will be weakened. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're already seeing that in the US, especially because they are pro-innovation. China is also pro-innovation as well.
Yeah.
And I think the only way that they will regulate ethics is when consumers, the public, make an uproar about it, about the harmful effects. But I think at the moment, the public are just very AI ignorant, can I say? There isn't enough awareness for them
Right.
to understand
Right.
actually how to bring that awareness, because the technology is just so new.
Right. And also in China, the public voices can be muted
Yeah.
due to censorship and information control, right?
But could I ask another question? Would you then not have a social issue in terms of, as I say, with more computer usage at local schools, you're going to get children who are exposed to harmful information without any type of filter. So how is that going to be an issue in the future, in your opinion,
Well,
or not?
right. There was actually a study, people look at, you know, the US TikTok versus the sister app called Douyin in China, which is a Chinese TikTok. And it's like they see, oh, why are there so many more pornography, hate speech, and more harmful content in the US? Why you don't see that in China?
Mm.
Because China, first number one priority, as we talk about in the talk, is information control, right? So they not only filter out those content that's deemed politically misaligned with the government, but also clean out a lot of other content, right? So-called harmful content that some of them you mentioned about, right? I mean, so during that process, they did make the Chinese TikTok very clean, you know, more healthy for the Chinese teenager in that sense. Nonetheless, they will still make sure the Chinese TikTok is very addictive, right? Because that's how they bring in businesses. Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Hey, okay. Great, thank you. My name is Zhang. I'm leading for education, Oxford here. So my question relates more to the economic perspective that you mentioned. How do you think China is going to navigate the geopolitical dynamics of AI development, particularly when they're trying to catch up with the US and they're trying to
Right.
conduct, let's say, partnership with third countries that do not align with Chinese regulatory framework? How do you think China can navigate that sort of dualism on, for example, if Africa is buying more into US kind of framework or the human rights aspect of the EU, and they want to do partnership with Chinese government for, let's say, critical data infrastructures to develop AI systems? How do you think that sort of geopolitical dynamics can influence how Chinese operate at the international level?
Well, China definitely have great ambition to become the leading rulemaker for the global South. Just last year, when China convened the third forum of Belt and Road Initiative, where over 130 countries attended, that was precisely at the keynote speech, Xi Jinping unveiled this China mega speech about China's global AI governance initiative. So China wants to showcase to its brothers in the developing country that we want to have a voice in this process, and I'm going to lead by example by formulating all these rules and legislations and trying to influence the global South, right? I mean, so we will have to wait and see how other countries will adapt and really buy into what the Chinese, philosophy, right? Because China is mostly talking without doing much, right? I mean, when you see what I have just talked about, right? I mean, so clearly how other countries will react to that. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thank you for the speech. I'm now doing a master here in OII, and my personal research interest now is about AI on social media, and especially for Chinese social media. And I noticed that AIGC disclosure on Chinese social media is not mandatory, but rather it's encouraged. AIGC disclosure.
You mean the generative AI?
Yeah, AI generated content disclosure. Like if my content as a content creator, if my content is generated by AI, I should label my content as AI generated.
Yeah.
But this movement is not mandatory. It's actually encouraged by different platforms. That means that now there's no Chinese law to enforce content creators to declare that their content is generated by AI.
Right.
So I'm thinking, have you predicted that to which extent or in which scenario that China will make this AIGC disclosure mandatory?
Well, I don't know when they will move ahead to mandate this requirement. I guess the reason why they don't do that in the first place is first, it's very hard to enforce the thing, right? You need to, how do you police? They need to put in a certain watermark. And also remember, we have the interim measures, right? by interim means that they are still thinking about how we should regulate this, and this could be subject to change. And later down the road, when they have formulate very clear standard settings for watermark technology, then they might mandate this. But at this point, I don't know when they are going to make this a strict requirement. Again, from that standpoint, they are not worried about AI generative output, whether it's fake or not. They're more worried about whether this is having a mobilizing effect that can mobilize public opinion, that can interfere with public discourse. This is the bottom line. This is the key priority, right? I mean, so those are not that key priority, but it seems to bring them a lot of work. So if you stand yourself into the shoes of the regulator, this is not what they want to do. It's not the top priority at the moment, right?
I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. We don't have any online, but any other questions in the room? Yes.
Yeah. Something I'm wondering about is why there are no state-owned enterprises. I mean, in China, there are many state-owned enterprises, of course, in many sectors of the economy.
Right.
Why is that not the case in tech? Or are there some state-owned enterprises, perhaps in infrastructure, not in service?
Right. I mean, so state-owned enterprises do have great ambition to offer AI services, but they are not the most dynamic enterprises to start with. And not surprisingly, they will lose out to the private enterprises. And if we think about, who can benefit most from the current generative AI boom, it will be still the pre-existing tech incumbents, being companies like Alibaba, ByteDance, and Tencent, because these firms, they have money, they have the capital, they have the talents, right? And most important, they have the data. They have amassed huge amount of data through, the previous services, right? Because they have a huge user base. So all these things create entry barriers for state-owned firms to compete with them. I mean, state-owned firm may excel in certain area where they have a lot of data, but they can't match up to Alibaba and Tencent. Just like the Chinese government want to introduce digital yuan, but still, and it's all online payment services. But it's nothing compared with what Alipay and WeChat Pay have done so far. It's just hard. Yeah.
Thank you. To my knowledge, I noticed that sometimes different policies in different locations use different words to describe AI, and maybe they have different illustrations of AI. So when you develop a kind of generalized framework, to what extent are cultures that maybe different regulators, they use the same language to talk different things, or they use a different language to talk about the same.
So you mean?
I mean, are they actually talking about AI or like digital algorithm, or?
You mean regulators? Are
Yeah.
they talking about the same thing when they
Yeah.
talk about AI? I mean, I can see, different regulators have different agendas because they have their, if they're a sector regulator to oversee particular sector, say I'm a Minister of Transportation, and this is a sector I oversee, and in terms of AI application, they would think about auto driving, this kind of things, right? I mean, they're thinking about different applications. So we have to be very context specific when we think about, the so-called AI discourse, right? Yeah, and how to regulate it.
Okay, makes sense.
So I think we can sneak in one more question.
There seems to be one area where the regulation is quite strict and effective. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that parents in the West were really envious about some of the regulations concerning social media, gaming.
Yeah. Right.
Would you say that this is an exception? How would you say that this is more than TikTok? Are these regulations effective, and aren't they harming the business models of the big tech, Chinese big tech?
They are harming the business fundamentals of these firms. I mean, that when they denounce Tencent's gaming as spiritual opium, and then and then when they make that, and they mentioned that in an op-ed published in the state media, and that already wiped out 13% of Tencent's stock prices the next day, right? I mean, so they don't need to go to punish the firm or introduce a Digital Service Act to regulate Tencent. Just one's opinions published in the state media is already sufficient to deter the firm from, from doing a lot of things, right? It's a very heavy-handed approach. To some extent, yes, this very paternalistic approach do have, you see, some benefits, right? But clearly in a democratic society, other people may disagree with you, what is right or wrong and what is good or bad for our children, right? I mean, but in the Chinese parents, they will see more cleaner, a cleaner TikTok than what you see in the US because of that. But I also want to mention that, no, look, I mean, the Chinese regulation, remember what I said, it's very volatile. So during the crackdown, it was very strict, but now it's entered into a phase of regulatory easing, right? I mean, so they're no longer policing it as strictly and enforce it as strictly before. So we are on the trend of moving to the other extreme and being very lax. So clearly how that may affect the enforcement, we have to wait and see. Yeah.
Okay, we do need to call it close there, but let me just take one more opportunity to thank Professor Zhang for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.